A billionaire left his wife over infertility, but when she crashed his second wedding, his perfect revenge shattered into pieces. The crystal champagne glass slipped from Alexander Kane's trembling fingers as he stared at the 4 identical little girls standing beside Sophia. Their bright gray eyes, his eyes, stared back at him with innocent curiosity. "Impossible," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the orchestra's sudden silence. 3 years ago, he'd walked away from their marriage believing the doctors who said he could never have children. He'd blamed Sophia, let his bitterness poison everything they'd built together. Now, watching his own features reflected in 4 small faces, Alexander felt his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. His new bride, Isabella Reynolds, grabbed his arm possessively. "Alexander, who are these children?" she demanded, but he barely heard her. All he could focus on were those 4 little girls and the devastating truth they represented. How could he have been so wrong? And, more importantly, could he ever make up for walking away? Before we begin, please consider subscribing as your support helps us create more meaningful stories for you. The Grand Plaza Hotel's ballroom, with its ornate chandeliers and marble columns, suddenly felt suffocating. Alexander remembered the day he'd left Sophia. The rain beating against their bedroom window like nature itself was weeping. She'd begged him to stay, to consider adoption, to remember the 15 years they'd shared. But he'd been consumed by his own pain, his desperate need for an heir to his empire. "They can't be," he muttered, taking an unsteady step forward. The youngest of the girls, they had to be at least 4 years old, clutched the hem of Sophia's elegant black dress, half hiding behind it. The sight sent a knife through his heart. His own daughter, afraid of him. Sophia stood tall, her silver-streaked dark hair swept up elegantly, her face showing the gentle lines of time they'd spent apart. She'd aged gracefully, unlike him. His expensive suits and carefully maintained appearance couldn't hide the bitterness that had carved itself into his features. "Their names," Sophia's voice carried across the now silent ballroom, steady and clear, "are Ava, Olivia, Ava, and Mia." She gently touched each little head as she spoke their names, and Alexander felt each one like a physical blow. Names. His daughters had names, personalities, entire lives he knew nothing about. Isabella's perfectly manicured nails dug into his arm. "Alexander," she hissed, "don't tell me you believe this obvious attempt at manipulation, on our wedding day of all times." Her voice dripped with venom, but for the first time Alexander heard it clearly. The cold calculation beneath her practiced concern. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd invited Sophia to his wedding as an act of spite, wanting her to witness his happiness with a younger, more suitable wife. Now, standing amid the wreckage of his perfect revenge, he realized fate had a cruel sense of humor. "How?" The question escaped his lips before he could stop it, his eyes never leaving the 4 identical faces that bore his features. The sharp jaw, the distinctive gray eyes, even the small dimple in their left cheeks. He saw himself in every detail. Sophia's eyes, those same warm brown eyes that had once looked at him with such love, now held a mixture of pain and resignation. "Remember that last night?" she asked softly, her voice meant only for him despite the hundreds of guests straining to hear. "When you told me we were over, that you couldn't bear to look at me anymore? I tried to tell you then, but you wouldn't listen. You were so angry, so hurt." The memory crashed over him like a wave. He'd been in such a rage that night, throwing clothes into suitcases, deaf to her pleas. She'd tried to tell him something, had begged him to sit down, to talk, but he'd stormed out into the rain, his pride and pain drowning out everything else. "I was pregnant," Sophia continued, her voice thick with unshed tears. "The fertility treatments had finally worked, but you never gave me the chance to tell you." The weight of Sophia's words hit Alexander like a physical blow. Pregnant. The fertility treatments had worked. All those years of trying, the countless doctor visits, the hope that had slowly turned to despair, and in the end, his own rage had blinded him to the miracle they'd been praying for. "You're lying," Isabella cut in, her voice sharp as broken glass. She stepped between them, her white wedding gown rustling like angry whispers. "This is nothing but a desperate attempt to ruin our wedding. Security!" She raised her perfectly manicured hand, signaling to the guards stationed at the doors. But Alexander caught her wrist, his grip firm but gentle. For the first time, he saw Isabella clearly, not as the young, beautiful woman who'd helped him forget his pain, but as someone who'd calculated every move, every smile, every touch. "No," he said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the entire room. "Let her speak." One of the girls, Olivia, he remembered the name with an ache in his heart, stepped forward, her small chin lifted in a gesture so familiar it took his breath away. It was the same way he'd held himself as a child, facing down the neighborhood bullies who'd mocked his second-hand clothes and empty lunchbox. "Mama says you build tall buildings," Olivia said, her voice clear and unafraid. "Is that true? Can you see the whole world from up there?" The simple question, asked with such innocent curiosity, shattered what remained of Alexander's composure. He thought of his penthouse office on the 50th floor, where he'd spent countless nights staring at the city lights below, trying to fill the void in his heart with more wealth, more success, more power. All that time, while he was building his empire of glass and steel, his daughters had been growing up without him. "Sometimes," he managed to answer, his voice rough with emotion, "but I'm beginning to think I missed seeing the most important things of all." Isabella's face contorted with fury. "This is ridiculous. Alexander, we have 200 guests waiting. The governor is here. The press—" "The press," Sophia interrupted, her quiet voice somehow cutting through Isabella's shrill protests. "Is that what this wedding is really about, Isabella? The press, the connections, the society pages?" She shook her head sadly. "I remember when Alexander used to talk about building things that would last, about leaving a legacy that meant something. Now look at all this." She gestured to the opulent ballroom, the ice sculptures, the champagne fountains. "It's all just for show, isn't it?" The truth of Sophia's words struck deep. Alexander looked around the ballroom, seeing it through new eyes. Every detail had been chosen to impress, to show off his wealth and power. Even his choice of bride, Isabella, 20 years his junior, with her society connections and magazine cover beauty, had been part of the facade. Ava, the quietest of the four, suddenly tugged at Sophia's dress. "Mama, can we go home? The lights are too bright here." Her small face looked overwhelmed by the grandeur surrounding her, and Alexander felt a fierce surge of protectiveness he'd never known before. "The lights are too bright," he echoed softly, loosening his bow tie. The gesture felt symbolic somehow, like unknotting the binds of the life he'd built on pride and bitterness. "All of this? It's too bright, too loud, too false." Isabella's perfectly composed facade finally cracked. "You can't be serious," she snarled, reaching for Alexander's arm again. "Think about what you're doing. Everything we've planned, everything we've built." "Everything you've planned, you mean?" Alexander's voice was quiet but firm. Old memories surfaced. Isabella's constant questions about his business holdings, her insistence on reviewing the prenuptial agreement with her own team of lawyers, the way she tried to rush the wedding once she discovered Sophia was back in New York. "Tell me, Isabella, when exactly did you learn about my daughters?" The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella's face paled, then flushed with anger. "I don't know what your reaction," Alexander continued, his business instincts finally overriding his emotional turmoil. "You weren't shocked to see 4 identical girls. You were angry. You already knew." Ava, the most observant of the 4, pressed closer to Sophia. "She was at our school last month, Daddy," she said softly. the word daddy, sending a jolt through Alexander's heart. She pretended to be lost, but she was taking pictures of us at recess. The murmurs from the wedding guests grew louder. Isabella's carefully constructed mask crumbled completely as she took a step back, her eyes darting between the exits like a cornered animal. "You knew," Alexander repeated, his voice growing stronger. "You knew I had children, and you kept it from me. Was this all part of your plan? Marry me quickly before I could discover the truth?" "You don't understand," Isabella spat, her refined accent slipping in her anger. "I did it for us. Those children, they would have ruined everything. Our perfect life, our future." "Perfect?" Sophia's quiet interjection cut through Isabella's rant. "There's nothing perfect about building a life on lies, Isabella. I learned that the hard way." She looked at Alexander, her eyes filled with regret. "When I discovered I was pregnant, I thought keeping it from you was protecting both you and our babies. I was wrong. Lies, even well-intentioned ones, only breed more pain." The truth of her words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He'd spent 3 years building a life based on appearances, on showing the world, and Sophia, that he'd moved on. But had he? Or had he just been hiding from his own pain, his own mistakes? Mia, the youngest of the 4, suddenly broke away from her sisters and walked straight up to Alexander. Her small hand reached up and touched his cheek, where an unexpected tear had fallen. "Don't cry, Daddy," she whispered, her gray eyes, his eyes, full of innocent concern. "Mama says it's never too late to fix mistakes." The simple wisdom of his daughter's words broke something open inside Alexander's chest. He knelt down to her level, not caring about his expensive tuxedo or the watching crowd. "How long?" he asked, looking up at Sophia. "How long have they known about me?" Sophia's eyes softened as she watched Alexander with Mia. "Since they could understand," she said quietly. "I showed them pictures, told them stories, about the brilliant, kind man who helped build half the skyline of New York, about their father who lost his way but who, I always believed, had enough love in his heart to find his way back." Isabella's laugh cut through the tender moment like a knife. "Kind? The Alexander Kane I know is anything but kind. Did you tell them how he threw you away? How he—" "That's enough." Alexander's voice was steel wrapped in silk. He stood slowly, keeping Mia's small hand in his. "You don't get to speak about things you don't understand, Isabella. Not anymore." The wedding guests had fallen into a hushed silence, watching the drama unfold like a theatrical production. But this was no play. These were real lives, real hearts being laid bare under the crystal chandeliers. Ava, emboldened by Mia's bravery, stepped forward. "We made you birthday cards," she said softly. "Every year. Mama helped us write them, but we did the drawings ourselves." She looked down at her patent leather shoes. "We kept them all in a special box, hoping." Alexander felt each word like a physical blow. Birthday cards he'd never seen, drawings he'd never admired, first words, first steps, first everything. All lost because of his pride, his anger, his inability to see beyond his own pain. "I have them all," Sophia added, her voice thick with emotion. "Every card, every drawing. I couldn't bear to throw them away. Even when you sent the wedding invitation, even when I read about your engagement in the papers, I kept hoping." "Hoping what?" Alexander asked, though he already knew the answer. It was the same hope he'd buried deep in his heart, covered with layers of bitterness and revenge. "Hoping you'd remember the man you used to be," Sophia answered simply. "The man who cried at our wedding because his vows meant so much to him. The man who spent weekends helping at the children's hospital, not because it was good PR, but because you genuinely cared." Olivia tugged at her mother's dress. "Is that why we volunteer at the hospital every Saturday? Because Daddy used to do it?" The innocent question landed like a thunderbolt in Alexander's heart. While he'd been building towers of glass and steel, hosting charity galas for show, Sophia had been teaching their daughters the real meaning of his former values. She hadn't just told them about their father, she'd shown them who he truly was, who he could be again. "This is all very touching," Isabella's voice dripped with sarcasm. "But need I remind everyone that this is supposed to be our wedding day? Alexander, the governor is waiting. The press can wait," Alexander interrupted, his voice steady. For the first time in years, he felt clarity cutting through the fog of bitterness and revenge. They can all wait. Isabella's composure shattered completely. "They can wait. They can wait." Her voice rose hysterically. "Do you have any idea what I've invested in this wedding? In you?" She stepped closer, dropping her voice to a venomous whisper. "If you ruin this, I'll make sure everyone knows about the Jackson deal, about the permits that mysteriously got approved, about dash. "Go ahead," Alexander interrupted, his voice surprisingly calm. The threat that would have terrified him an hour ago now seemed trivial compared to the weight of his daughter's birthday cards, stored carefully away in a box he'd never seen. "Destroy my reputation, my business, everything, some things." He looked at his daughters, standing brave and beautiful beside their mother. Some things matter more. Ava, always the perceptive one, studied Isabella with a child's direct gaze. "You're not very nice," she said simply. "Daddy wouldn't want to marry someone who isn't nice. That's what Mama always told us about him." A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd. Isabella's face contorted with rage as she realized her carefully laid plans were crumbling. "Security!" she screamed. "Remove them! All of them!" But Alexander held up his hand, and the security guards, men who'd worked for him for years, didn't move. "The only person leaving," he said quietly, "is you, Isabella. And take your threats with you. I'm done being afraid of losing things that don't really matter." He turned to Sophia, really looking at her for the first time in years. The silver in her hair caught the light like strands of starlight. The fine lines around her eyes spoke of both laughter and tears, of years spent raising their daughters alone, of strength he'd been too blind to see. "I almost married my revenge," he said softly. The words meant only for her. "I was so caught up in hurting you that I couldn't see I was only hurting myself. And worse." His voice cracked as he looked at his daughters. "I was hurting them." Grace, who had been quiet until now, suddenly spoke up. "Mama, remember the story you tell us, about the man who built his house on sand?" Her clear voice carried in the hushed ballroom. "You said sometimes people have to lose everything to find what really matters." Tears welled in Sophia's eyes. "You remember that story?" "We remember all the stories," Eva added, "about Daddy, about you, about love being stronger than pride." Alexander felt something break inside him, not the shattering of his carefully constructed world, but the breaking of chains he'd forged himself. Years of bitterness, of pride, of trying to prove something to someone who'd never stopped believing in him anyway. Isabella stormed toward the exit, her wedding dress rustling like angry whispers against the marble floor. "You'll regret this, Alexander," she spat. "Everything you've built, everything you are." "Everything I am?" Alexander's quiet voice stopped her. "Look at them, Isabella." He gestured to his daughters. "They're everything I am, everything I should have been, everything I can still be, if they'll give me the chance." The grand ballroom fell silent as Isabella's clicking heels faded away. 200 guests, the governor, the press, none of them mattered anymore. Alexander turned to Sophia, his heart pounding with a fear greater than any business deal had ever caused. "I know I don't deserve it," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I know 3 years of absence can't be erased in a moment, but if you'll let me—" He knelt down, not caring about his expensive tuxedo or the watching crowd, to be at eye level with his daughters. "If you'll all let me, I'd like to try to make up for lost time." Mia, the youngest, reached out and touched his cheek again, wiping away tears he hadn't realized were falling. "Daddy," she said with the simple wisdom only a child could possess, "you're crying happy tears now." Eva stepped forward next, pulling something from the small purse that matched her dress. It was a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges from being handled often. "I brought my latest birthday card," she said shyly, in case we met you today." Alexander's hands trembled as he took the paper. The crayon drawing showed a tall building with a little girl at the top, holding hands with a man in a suit. Beneath it, in careful child's handwriting, "Dear Daddy, I hope you can see me from up there. Love, Eva." A sob escaped him. Not the quiet, controlled tears he'd shed at his parents' funeral, but raw, healing tears that shook his whole body. The other girls moved forward as if drawn by magnetic force, their small arms wrapping around him in a group hug that felt like coming home. Sophia watched, her own tears falling freely now. The wedding guests began to quietly file out, understanding that they were witnessing something far more sacred than any ceremony could have been. "We have a tradition," Olivia said suddenly, her voice muffled against Alexander's shoulder. "Every Sunday, we have pancakes with chocolate chips and tell stories. Mama says—" She pulled back to look at him hopefully. "Mama says you used to make the best pancakes." Alexander looked up at Sophia, seeing in her eyes not the bitter recrimination he deserved, but the same gentle understanding she'd always had. "Your mother," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "never lost faith in who I could be, even when I lost it myself." Rising slowly from his knees, Alexander kept one hand clasped in Mia's tiny grip, while the other still held Eva's treasured birthday card. The emptying ballroom seemed to echo with the ghosts of what might have been: a loveless marriage, a life built on revenge, 4 little girls growing up wondering why their father never came to find them. "The penthouse," he said suddenly, looking at Sophia. "The one on Central Park West. I never sold it. Their first home together, where they'd spent 15 happy years before everything fell apart. It's exactly as you left it. I couldn't bear to change anything." Sophia's eyes widened with understanding. The art she'd chosen, the garden she'd planted on the terrace, the nursery they'd prepared together in hopes of a child, he'd kept it all, like a museum of their lost dreams. "Even the cookie jar?" Eva asked innocently. "Mama says she used to hide your favorite chocolate chip cookies in a special jar shaped like a teddy bear." Alexander's laugh came out more like a sob. "Even the cookie jar," he confirmed, "though I haven't opened it since." He couldn't finish the sentence, but Sophia nodded, understanding as she always had. "Perhaps," she said carefully, her voice soft with hope, "it's time to fill it again. The girls love baking cookies on Saturday mornings." Grace tugged at his sleeve. "Can we see it? The house where you and Mama lived? Can we make cookies there?" Looking at their hopeful faces, Alexander realized something profound. The penthouse he'd preserved like a mausoleum of his past happiness could become something else entirely. Not a monument to what he'd lost, but a bridge to what he might still rebuild. "Of course we can," he said, then looked uncertainly at Sophia. "That is, if your mother thinks it's all right." "What do you think, girls?" Sophia asked, including their daughters in the decision. "Should we show Daddy how we make our special Sunday pancakes tomorrow morning? After all," she added softly, "he might remember a few secrets about making them perfect." The girls' enthusiastic response brought fresh tears to Alexander's eyes, but these were different from the bitter tears he'd shed alone in that empty penthouse. These were tears of possibility, of hope, of a future he'd never dared to imagine. "I have a lot to learn," he admitted, looking at each of his daughters in turn. "About being a father, about making up for lost time. I'll make mistakes, but I promise you this: I will never walk away again. Not from any of you." Olivia, wise beyond her years, squeezed his hand. "Mama says everyone makes mistakes, Daddy. The brave ones are those who try to fix them." Outside the Grand Plaza Hotel, the late afternoon sun painted the New York skyline in shades of gold and amber. Alexander looked up at the buildings he'd constructed over the years, seeing them differently now. Not as monuments to his success, but as markers of all the moments he'd missed while chasing the wrong kind of legacy. "That's your building, isn't it, Daddy?" Eva pointed to the gleaming Kane Tower in the distance. "The one with the big K on top? We can see it from our school playground." "You can?" Alexander's voice caught. All this time, his daughters had been looking up at his buildings while he'd been too blind to look down and see them. Mia yawned, the excitement of the day finally catching up with her. Without thinking, Alexander scooped her up in his arms. She nestled against his shoulder as if she'd been doing it all her life, and the trust in that simple gesture nearly brought him to his knees. "The car's this way," Sophia said softly, gathering the other girls. "We parked in the side lot to avoid—" Well, she didn't need to finish. To avoid the media, the wedding guests, the spectacle their arrival had created. "Wait," Alexander said, reaching into his pocket with his free hand. He pulled out his phone and, with a few quick taps, made a call. "James." "The penthouse needs to be ready in an hour." "Yes, everything. And James? Send someone to that little Italian bakery on Thompson Street, the one that makes Sophia's favorite cannoli," Sophia finished with him, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. "You remember." "I remember everything," he said quietly. "I just forgot what mattered." As they walked toward Sophia's car, a sensible family SUV that couldn't have been more different from his fleet of luxury vehicles, Alexander felt the weight of his designer watch, his expensive cufflinks, all the trappings of the life he'd built to prove something to the world. None of it meant anything compared to the weight of his sleeping daughter in his arms, the sound of his other girls chattering excitedly about showing him their favorite books and toys. The media would have a field day. Isabella would probably follow through on her threats. His business might suffer, his reputation might take hits, but for the first time in years, Alexander Kane felt truly rich. "You know," Grace said thoughtfully as they reached the car, "in all Mama's stories about you, my favorite was the one about the man who had everything but didn't know it until he thought he'd lost it all." Sophia helped buckle the sleepy Mia into her car seat as Alexander stood there, absorbing his daughter's words. "And how does that story end?" he asked softly. "We don't know yet," Sophia answered, her brown eyes meeting his. "But I think we might be about to find out." As the family drove through the streets of Manhattan toward the penthouse that had stood frozen in time, Alexander realized that the ending of their story didn't matter as much as the fact that they would write it together. Every Sunday pancake breakfast, every bedtime story, every small moment of trust rebuilt. These would be the true measure of his success. The sun set behind them, casting long shadows of their car across the pavement. Ahead, the lights of the city began to twinkle like stars, promising not an ending, but a beginning. A second chance that had come disguised as revenge, a wedding day that had turned into something far more sacred. The day Alexander Kane finally learned that the greatest thing a man could build wasn't a tower of steel and glass, but a bridge back to the hearts he'd left behind. Life, he realized, watching his daughters' faces in the rearview mirror, sometimes gives us exactly what we need, even when it arrives in ways we never expected. And love, true love, never loses faith. It just waits patiently for us to find our way back home. If this story moved you, consider sharing it with someone you care about. Life's unexpected turns can hurt us deeply, but they can also lead us toward true healing, if we have the courage to face the truth and fight for what really matters. A simple thank you in the comments goes a long way, and if you'd like more stories that explore the power of redemption and family, don't forget to like and subscribe. After all, sometimes the greatest triumph is finding your way back home.